Four names became synonymous with the biggest band in the history of popular music: John, Paul, George, and Ringo. But when people talk about the Beatles, they don't talk about all four of them the same way.
We didn't get along. We were four guys. We had rows. It never got in the way of the music, no matter how bad the row was. Once the counting, we all gave our best.
John Lennon was the visionary. Paul McCartney was the once-in-a-generation songwriter. George Harrison was the quiet musical force who pushed the band into new territory. And Ringo Starr was the funny one, the cheerful one, the lucky one who just happened to be sitting behind the drums when lightning struck. That's the version of the story most people grew up with.
And that was a little later too, which I think is a natural thing, you know. Suddenly we've got lives and I've got children, and you know, the effort that we put in, because we worked really hard.
And for a long time, it was the only version anyone cared to tell. But here's the thing about simple stories: they're almost never the whole truth. Because if Ringo Starr was simply lucky, then why did three of the most talented musicians in history personally choose him to join their band? Why did producers and engineers marvel at his consistency in the studio? Why did fellow drummers, from Phil Collins to Dave Grohl, name him as a direct influence? And why, when the Beatles collapsed and the world assumed Ringo would disappear, did he not only survive, but build a career that lasted more than half a century beyond the band? The real story of Ringo Starr isn't about a man who won the lottery of rock and roll. It's about a professional musician who was underestimated from the beginning, a man who earned his place, lost his identity when the band ended, nearly destroyed himself, found his way back, and kept making music long after the world had stopped expecting anything from him. This is what really happened to the Beatle nobody understood. To understand Ringo Starr, you have to understand where he came from. And where he came from was about as far from fame as you could possibly get. He was born Richard Starkey on July 7, 1940, in Dingle, a tough, working-class neighborhood in Liverpool, England. His parents were bakery workers. His father left the family when Richie, as everyone called him, was just 3 years old. His mother, Elsie, took on cleaning jobs and eventually worked as a barmaid to keep a roof over their heads. They lived in a tiny house without a bathroom. It was a world of coal smoke, narrow streets, and constant financial pressure. But Elsie was fierce in her devotion to her only child. And when she eventually remarried, her new husband, Harry Graves, was a kind man who brought stability and warmth into the household. But stability didn't last long. At the age of 6, Richie Starkey developed appendicitis. The appendix ruptured. He contracted peritonitis, a dangerous infection of the abdominal lining, and fell into a coma. His mother was told 3 times that her son might not survive the night. One of those nights was the eve of his 7th birthday. He did survive, but the recovery was brutal. After about 6 months in the hospital, the boy got excited one day, fell out of bed, and tore open his stitches. That meant emergency surgery and another 6 months of recovery. In total, he spent an entire year in Liverpool's Myrtle Street Children's Hospital. When he finally came home, he was so far behind in school that he could barely read or write. A neighbor, Marie Maguire Crawford, tutored him until he began to catch up. And then, at the age of 13, he contracted tuberculosis. This time, he was sent to a sanatorium, where he would spend 2 more years of his childhood away from home. 3 years of hospitals in total before he was old enough to hold a real job. For most people, that kind of childhood would have been crushing, and in many ways it was. Richie Starkey never did catch up academically. He left school without qualifications and went to work, first on the railways, then as an apprentice machinist at a factory called Henry Hunt & Son. But something happened in that sanatorium that would change everything. To keep the children occupied, the staff organized a small band. They handed out instruments, percussion mostly, tambourines, triangles, maracas. A teacher put up a large white sheet with colored symbols, red for drums, yellow for tambourines, green for triangles. The children would play along as she pointed to the colors. Richie picked up the drums, and he never put them down. It wasn't an instant transformation. He banged on tin cans and biscuit tins before he ever got near a real kit. His stepfather Harry, who loved big band music, encouraged him. And when the skiffle craze swept through Britain in the late 1950s, the teenager finally had a musical world he could step into. Skiffle was simple, raw, and accessible. You didn't need expensive instruments. You didn't need formal training. You just needed energy and a willingness to play. For a young man with no academic credentials and a body that had already been through more than most people endure in a lifetime, it was an open door. In 1957, he co-founded his first group, the Eddie Clayton Skiffle Group, and started playing local gigs around Liverpool. But skiffle didn't last. Rock and roll was coming, hard and fast, from across the Atlantic. And as the music changed, so did the bands. In late 1958, Richie Starkey joined a group called Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, led by a charismatic, athletic singer named Alan Caldwell, who had reinvented himself as Rory Storm. It was here that Richie reinvented himself too. He wore rings on almost every finger, a habit that gave off a country western vibe that the group loved. His bandmates started calling him Ringo, and because Starkey didn't exactly sound like a rock and roll name, he shortened it to Starr. The name had a certain flash to it, Ringo Starr. It sounded like a cowboy from a western, which for a young man raised on Saturday afternoon cinema was exactly the point. By 1960, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes were one of the biggest acts in Liverpool. They were so popular that when a German promoter offered them a residency at his club in Hamburg, they were initially given the headlining spot. That same promoter had also brought over another Liverpool band, a younger group that was still scrappy and unpolished. That group was the Beatles. Ringo and the Beatles orbited each other in Hamburg and back in Liverpool, playing the same venues, sharing the same stages, and every time the Beatles' regular drummer, Pete Best, couldn't make a gig, Ringo would sit in. The three other Beatles noticed something they liked. And this is where the story most people know begins, but the version they know is incomplete. In August 1962, the Beatles were at a crossroads. They had secured a recording contract with Parlophone, a subsidiary of EMI, which put them under the guidance of producer George Martin. But Martin had reservations about their drummer. Pete Best's playing was rigid, inconsistent in the studio, and didn't quite fit the evolving sound the band was chasing. More than that, Best had never really clicked with the other three personally. He was quiet, a bit aloof, and didn't share their sense of humor or their growing ambitions. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison had already made up their minds. They wanted Ringo. They had played with him enough times to know that he brought something they needed. Not just technical competence, but feel, chemistry. A way of locking in with the other instruments that made the whole band sound bigger, tighter, more alive. Their manager, Brian Epstein, was given the unenviable task of firing Best. He later called it one of the most difficult things he ever had to do. There were even protests from fans at early shows. Some chanted for Pete's return, but John, Paul, and George didn't waver. Ringo got the call while he was at a Butlins holiday camp with the Hurricanes. Epstein asked him to join the Beatles. Ringo said yes immediately, but asked if he could finish the week so Rory Storm could find a replacement drummer. He showed up that Saturday, and the Fab Four, as the world would come to know them, was complete. What most people don't realize is that even then, Ringo almost didn't get to play on the Beatles' first recordings. George Martin, still uncertain about this new drummer, had already hired a session musician named Andy White to play on their debut session. Ringo was handed a tambourine. It was humiliating, and it stung, but it was also temporary. Martin quickly realized what the band already knew. Ringo wasn't just adequate, he was exactly right. To understand why, you have to understand what made Ringo's drumming different. And to understand that, you have to let go of everything you think you know about what makes a great drummer. Ringo wasn't a technical showman. He didn't play blazing solos. He didn't wow audiences with speed or complexity. When the Beatles were asked about drum solos, Paul McCartney remembered Ringo's answer perfectly. He said Ringo told them he hated drum solos. The other three loved him for it. Ringo's genius was in the opposite direction. He played for the song. Every beat, every fill, every accent was in service of whatever the track needed. He wasn't trying to prove he was the best drummer in the room. He was trying to make the song the best it could be. And in that pursuit, he was almost unnaturally consistent. Mark Lewison, who documented every single day the Beatles ever spent in the studio, found that in 8 years of recording, sessions broke down because of Ringo's mistakes fewer than a dozen times. The vast majority of retakes were caused by errors from the other three. But consistency alone doesn't explain the sound. The real secret was physical. Ringo was naturally left-handed but played a right-handed drum kit. His grandmother, worried about left-handedness, had encouraged him to switch hands as a child, so he grew up caught between two instincts. When he sat down at a right-handed setup, his fills naturally moved in the opposite direction from what a right-handed drummer would play. His left hand led. His patterns went counterclockwise across the toms. It gave everything he played a slightly off-kilter, almost swinging quality that no one else could replicate. He knew it too. He once explained that because he couldn't do the normal thing, he had to break everything up. And that's what created his style. You can hear it everywhere. The descending tom pattern on Come Together, the tumbling fills in A Day in the Life, the hypnotic pulse of Tomorrow Never Knows, the relentless shuffle on Rain, which Paul McCartney later called one of Ringo's finest performances. Each one of those parts is instantly recognizable. Play any of them in isolation, without the guitars, without the vocals, and a Beatles fan will know exactly which song it is. That's not luck. That's artistry. George Martin, the man who produced nearly every Beatles record, put it simply. He said Ringo never overplayed. He always played the right thing at the right time. McCartney called his drumming the magic glue of the band. Phil Collins, himself one of the most successful drummers in rock history, went further. He said the drum fills on A Day in the Life are so complex that you could take a great drummer today, tell them to play exactly that, and they wouldn't know where to begin. And yet, despite all of this, the public never quite saw Ringo that way. To the world, he was the lovable sidekick, the clown, the one who sang silly songs like Yellow Submarine and Octopus's Garden. When people ranked the Beatles, Ringo almost always came last. There's even an old joke, falsely attributed to John Lennon, claiming he said Ringo wasn't even the best drummer in the Beatles. Lennon never said it. The line came from a British comedian in 1983. But the fact that so many people believed it tells you everything about how Ringo was perceived. The reasons are understandable, if unfair. In a band that included two of the greatest songwriters in popular music history and a guitarist whose spiritual and musical depth reshaped rock, the drummer was never going to be the center of attention. Ringo's songwriting contributions were modest. He wrote Don't Pass Me By and Octopus's Garden and received co-writing credits on a handful of others, but he was never going to compete with Lennon and McCartney on that front. His singing voice, warm and full of character but technically limited, was typically given one song per album, often something lighthearted. But here's what the public perception missed. Ringo's bandmates trusted him completely. They relied on him. And he was far more than a drummer. He had a natural screen presence that became obvious the moment the Beatles started making films. In A Hard Day's Night, released in 1964, it was Ringo who stole the movie. His solo sequence, where he wanders along a riverbank looking lost and melancholy, was the emotional heart of the film. Director Richard Lester later said that Ringo had a gift for the camera that the other three didn't quite possess. He was natural, unguarded, real. He carried that quality through Help, and later into roles beyond the Beatles. He acted alongside Peter Sellers in The Magic Christian. He narrated the children's television series Thomas the Tank Engine. He was charming, funny, and effortlessly likable. Audiences responded to him not because he was the most talented person in the room, but because he was the most human. And that humanity would be tested more severely than anyone expected. By the late 1960s, the Beatles were falling apart. The tensions had been building for years. Creative disagreements between Lennon and McCartney had grown sharper. George Harrison was increasingly frustrated that his songs were being sidelined. Business disputes, particularly the acrimonious split over management between Alan Klein and the Eastman family, poisoned relationships that had survived a decade of extraordinary pressure. Ringo felt it all. He was the peacemaker, the one who got along with everyone. But even he reached a breaking point. During the recording of the White Album in 1968, he briefly quit the band. He felt his playing wasn't being appreciated. He felt like an outsider in a group that was increasingly fragmenting into individual projects. He went home and told his wife he'd left. A few days later, the other three persuaded him to come back. When he returned to the studio, he found his drum kit covered in flowers. It was their way of saying they needed him. But the reconciliation was temporary. By 1970, the Beatles were finished. Paul McCartney publicly announced the breakup in April. The legal battles dragged on for years. For Ringo, the end of the Beatles wasn't just the end of a band. It was the end of an identity. For nearly a decade, he had been Ringo Starr, Beatle. Everything he did, Everywhere he went, every time he picked up a drumstick, it was in the context of that larger entity. Now suddenly, he had to answer a question he had never really faced. Who was Ringo Starr on his own? The first answers came quickly, and they were surprisingly varied. His debut solo album, Sentimental Journey, released in 1970, was a collection of pre-rock standards, the kind of songs his mother used to sing in the pubs of Liverpool. It wasn't a rock album. It wasn't trying to be. It was a personal project, a love letter to his childhood. That same year, he flew to Nashville and recorded Bocas of Blues, a country album that revealed something most Beatles fans had never considered. The Beatle most associated with British rock and roll had a deep, abiding love for American country music. It made sense if you knew his history. Ringo had grown up watching Saturday matinee westerns, singing cowboys and dusty plains. His stage name came from westerns. His love of country music wasn't new. It had been there since childhood, buried under the weight of Beatlemania. And then came the hits. In 1971, Ringo released It Don't Come Easy, a single that briefly made him the most commercially successful solo Beatle. It outsold the singles that John, Paul, and George released in the same period. He followed it with Back Off Boogaloo in 1972. And in 1973 came the album Ringo, produced by Richard Perry, which remains the creative high point of his solo career. It featured two #1 singles, Photograph, a wistful ballad co-written with George Harrison, and a rollicking cover of You're 16. The album was also notable for another reason. All four former Beatles contributed to the first time they had all participated in the same project since the breakup. John Lennon wrote and performed on I'm the Greatest. McCartney wrote 6 O'Clock. Harrison played guitar on multiple tracks. By 1974, Ringo had scored 7 consecutive top 10 singles. He was, for a brief and improbable moment, the most successful solo Beatle on the American charts. John Lennon reportedly sent him a telegram after the success of the Ringo album that read, "Congratulations, how dare you, and please write me a hit song." But the momentum didn't last, and what replaced it was darkness. The late 1970s and 1980s were, by Ringo's own admission, largely lost to alcohol and drugs. The decline was gradual at first. He had always enjoyed a drink. The culture of rock and roll, the parties, the late nights, the constant access to excess, made it easy to slide from social drinking into something far more destructive. He joined the Hollywood Vampires, a notorious Los Angeles drinking club founded by Alice Cooper that counted Keith Moon and Harry Nilsson among its regulars. As Ringo later put it, they were no longer musicians dabbling in drugs and alcohol. They had become people dabbling in music. His albums during this period reflected the chaos. They were unfocused, commercially unsuccessful, and made with diminishing care. By 2015, speaking to the Times of London, he admitted what everyone around him already knew. He said he was drunk. He said he didn't notice. He said some of those years are absolutely gone. In 1981, Ringo married actress Barbara Bach, whom he had met on the set of a film called Caveman. They fell deeply in love, but the relationship also enabled both of their addictions. They drank together. They used together. By the mid-1980s, Ringo was consuming staggering quantities of alcohol daily. Barbara had her own struggles with prescription medications. The turning point came in 1988, and it was as brutal as anything Ringo had experienced since those childhood hospital beds. He blacked out one night and woke up the next afternoon to learn from his staff that he had destroyed the house so badly they thought it had been broken into by burglars. Worse, he had been violent toward Barbara. The staff told him they had feared she was dead. For a man who had spent his entire career being the cheerful one, the funny one, the easygoing one, that moment was a reckoning. He and Barbara made the decision together. 3 days later, they checked into a rehabilitation facility in Tucson, Arizona. Ringo has spoken about those early days of recovery with remarkable honesty. He said it took him 8 days to accept that he was there to get help. He said he did whatever they asked him to do. He said there were moments, especially after performing, when every nerve in his body screamed at him to go back to the way things were. He would sit on his drum seat after a show and just hold on, physically gripping the stool, fighting the urge, but he didn't go back. He and Barbara walked out of that clinic sober, and they have remained sober ever since. Sobriety changed everything. With his head clear for the first time in years, Ringo felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. He wanted to work, not out of obligation, not to fill time, because he genuinely wanted to play music again. In 1989, less than a year after leaving rehab, he formed the first incarnation of Ringo Starr and his All-Star Band. The concept was simple and brilliant. Instead of trying to assemble a traditional backing band, Ringo invited established musicians, each of them a star in their own right, to join him on tour. The first lineup included Joe Walsh, Billy Preston, Dr. John, Levon Helm, Nils Lofgren, Clarence Clemens, and others. Each member would sing their own hits during the show, and the whole band would back each other up. It was collaborative, generous, and unpretentious. It was also a revelation. For the first time, Ringo wasn't trying to be a solo star. He wasn't trying to replace the Beatles. He had found something else entirely. A way to keep playing, to keep performing, to stay connected to music without carrying the impossible burden of being a former Beatle trying to prove he could stand alone. The All-Star Band became Ringo's creative engine for the next 3 decades. The lineup changed constantly, cycling through dozens of musicians from different generations and genres. Todd Rundgren, Peter Frampton, Sheila E., Steve Lukather, Greg Lake, Howard Jones. The names read like a history of popular music. And Ringo was at the center of it all, not as the biggest star in the room, but as the host, the ringmaster, the man whose warmth and humor held the whole thing together. Alongside the touring, he kept recording. The albums weren't chart toppers, they weren't trying to be, but they were consistent, honest, and often more enjoyable than critics gave them credit for. And through it all, Ringo maintained the relationships that had defined his life. His friendship with George Harrison remained deep and genuine until Harrison's death from cancer in 2001. The two had always been the closest pair within the Beatles, the quiet ones who understood each other. Ringo was at Harrison's bedside in his final days, and he later performed Photograph, the song they had written together nearly 3 decades earlier at the Concert for George in 2002. His relationship with Paul McCartney endured as well, evolving from the complicated post-breakup years into a genuine and lasting friendship. They played on each other's records, they appeared together in public. They remained the last 2 surviving Beatles, a bond that carried a weight no one else could fully understand. And then there was John Lennon. Ringo and John had remained close throughout the 1970s, despite everything. They recorded together, they spent time together in New York. When Lennon was murdered outside his apartment building in December 1980, Ringo and Barbara flew to New York immediately. It was a loss that never fully healed. In the years that followed, Ringo's relationship with Lennon's legacy took on a quieter dimension. He didn't exploit it. He didn't trade on it. He simply carried it with him, the way you carry any friendship that ended too soon. What's remarkable about Ringo's later career is not its commercial scale, but its consistency and its lack of pretension. He didn't spend decades trying to convince the world he was underrated. He didn't wage public campaigns for recognition. He just kept working. He kept touring. He kept recording. He kept showing up. And the world, slowly, began to see what his bandmates had always seen. In 2015, Ringo was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist, having already been inducted as a Beatle in 1988. In 2018, he was knighted by Prince William for his contributions to music and charity. He became Sir Richard Starkey, an honor he now shares with McCartney. But perhaps the most telling measure of his legacy isn't the awards or the titles. It's the fact that at age 85, Ringo Starr is still making music. In 2025, he released Look Up, his first country album in more than 50 years, produced and co-written by T-Bone Burnett. It featured collaborations with Billy Strings, Alison Krauss, and Molly Tuttle, musicians from a generation that wasn't born when the Beatles broke up. It reached #1 on the country album charts. And in 2026, he followed it with Long Long Road, another country record, his 22nd studio album. T-Bone Burnett, who spent decades producing some of the most respected albums in American music, said something about Ringo that cuts to the heart of everything. He said Ringo changed the way every drummer after him played. He called him a killer rockabilly singer and a heartbreaking ballad singer. And he said that none of the work he himself had done in a long life in music would have happened if not for Ringo and his band. That's not the kind of thing you say about a lucky drummer.
Oh, so was Ringo Starr really the lucky Beatle?
Luck was certainly part of the story. He was in the right city, he was playing in the right circles, he was available when the Beatles needed a new drummer. You can't tell Ringo's story without acknowledging the role that timing played. But luck doesn't explain why the Beatles chose him over every other drummer in Liverpool. Luck doesn't explain why George Martin, one of the most discerning producers in the history of recorded music, came to depend on his playing. Luck doesn't explain those fills on A Day in the Life, or the groove on Come Together, or the heartbeat of Rain. Luck doesn't explain how a man who nearly died twice before the age of 15 went on to play on records that sold hundreds of millions of copies worldwide. Luck doesn't explain how he survived the breakup of the biggest band in history, the loss of his closest friends, and a decade of addiction that nearly killed him. And luck certainly doesn't explain how he came out the other side, sober, creative, generous, and still playing drums into his 9th decade. The world saw the quiet Beatle, the funny Beatle, the lucky Beatle, the one sitting in the back, behind the kit, behind the more famous faces, behind the louder voices. But underneath all of that was something the casual observer missed entirely: a working musician who started with nothing, a survivor who fought his way back from illness, from obscurity, from addiction, from grief, a collaborator who understood, long before most people did, that the greatest thing a musician can do is not stand in front of the song, but stand behind it. Ringo Starr spent his entire career sitting behind the world's most famous band, behind the drums, behind the spotlight, behind the legend. But maybe the most remarkable thing he ever did was prove that when the Beatles ended, Ringo Starr didn't. He kept playing, he kept showing up, he kept choosing the music. And more than 60 years after he first picked up a pair of drumsticks in a hospital ward in Liverpool, he still hasn't stopped.